Hey guys! Tonight, we're quietly stepping into the strange, and often uncomfortable, world of medieval life at sea. When we think of pirates, we usually imagine maps, treasure, and loud battles on open water. The kind of stories filled with adventure and freedom. But the reality of life aboard a medieval ship was far less romantic, because for the men who spent months at sea, the ocean was not a place of excitement. It was a floating world of wood, rope, and endless motion. A world where the ground never stayed still. And where comfort slowly stopped existing altogether. Imagine the air inside those narrow decks. Thick with salt, damp wood, sweat, and the constant smell of old supplies that could never truly stay fresh. There were no clean rooms, no quiet corners, and no real escape from the presence of others. Every sound, every movement, every breath belonged to the ship and sleep. Something we take for granted. Was never simple. Some pirates rested in cramped hammocks swinging with the waves, while others simply lay on hard wooden planks, trying to ignore the cold, the noise, and the fear of what the sea might bring before morning. Food spoiled quickly. Fresh water was always uncertain. Storms could last for days without warning. And through all of it, there was no real pause button, only the slow, exhausting rhythm of survival. Tonight, we're going behind the stories of gold and rebellion. To see what life at sea actually felt like for the people who lived it every day, we'll talk about how pirates slept in impossible conditions. How they managed hunger and disease in the middle of nowhere. And why so many of them were never truly safe, even when the sea was calm, because beneath the legends of freedom and adventure, there was a far more quiet and uncomfortable truth. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these slow journeys through the hidden corners of history. And as always, feel free to share where you're listening from. It's always calming to see this community spread across the world. Now, lower the lights. Get comfortable. And let's slowly drift back into the dark wooden world of medieval ships. Out on the endless sea, long before the ocean became filled with modern engines and bright navigation lights, the medieval sea was a place of uncertainty. At night, ships vanished into complete darkness only a few miles from shore. There were no radios, no forecasts, no quick rescue waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Only black water and wind, and the endless sound of wood groaning against the sea. Pirate ships during the medieval world were not the giant floating fortresses people often imagine today. Many were surprisingly small. Narrow wooden vessels built more for survival and comfort. Their decks creaked constantly beneath wet boots and heavy barrels. Salt water soaked nearly everything. Ropes hung from masts like tangled spider webs, dripping during storms and snapping violently in strong winds. At sunrise, the ship often appeared beautiful from a distance. Golden light touching the sails. Calm waves rolling beneath the hull. Seabirds circling overhead, but that beauty disappeared quickly once you stepped aboard. The lower decks were dim and crowded. Lantern light barely reached the corners. Rats moved quietly between barrels of dried meat and sacks of grain. Water leaked through old planks during rough weather, leaving the floor permanently damp. Clothes rarely dried properly. Blankets smelled of mildew. Even breathing sometimes felt heavy inside the stale air trap below deck. Most pirates were not fearless adventurers searching for glory. Many were desperate men escaping hunger, debt, punishment, or war back on land. Some had once been fishermen. Others were former sailors abandoned by merchant fleets. A few were criminals with nowhere else to go. The sea became less of a choice, and more of a final direction. Once a ship left port, life changed immediately. Days blended together under endless skies. Time was measured through bells, shifting winds, and fading supplies rather than calendars. A pirate might wake before dawn to freezing rain, spend the afternoon repairing torn sails beneath burning sunlight, then fall asleep hours later while waves slammed against the hull hard enough to shake his bones. Nothing stayed stable for long. Even simple tasks became exhausting on moving water. Carrying barrels across the deck during rough seas could break a leg. Climbing wet rigging in strong winds could send a sailor vanishing into the ocean forever. One missed grip. One loose knot. One unexpected wave. And a man could disappear into darkness without slowing the ship at all, because stopping was dangerous, and sometimes impossible. Out there, far from land, the ship itself became an entire world. Every pirate depended completely on the people around him, even the ones he disliked. Arguments spread quickly in cramped spaces. Fear spread even faster. During long silent nights, sailors listened carefully to every unusual sound. The crack of timber. The sudden shift of cargo below deck. The distant rumble of thunder somewhere beyond the fog. The ocean had a way of making people feel small, not immediately, but slowly, quietly, like a feeling creeping into the corners of the mind during sleepless nights. And yet, despite the cold, the hunger, the sickness, and the endless uncertainty, ships continued pushing deeper into unknown waters. Because somewhere beyond the storms and darkness, pirates believed something else might be waiting: gold, supplies, freedom, or perhaps simply another sunrise. And as the medieval ship drifted deeper into the black ocean night, the wooden walls groaning softly around its exhausted crew, the true reality of life at sea was only beginning. By the second week at sea, the memory of land already began to feel strange, not gone completely, but distant, like a dream fading quietly after waking. The pirates aboard the ship no longer spoke much about home. At first, during the early days after leaving port, conversations had drifted toward warm taverns, crowded markets, familiar streets, and the smell of fresh bread rising from village ovens before sunrise. But out here, surrounded by nothing except water and sky, those memories slowly lost their shape, because the sea had a way of replacing the world. Little by little, the ship itself became everything. Morning began before sunlight fully reached the horizon. Sailors woke to the sound of boots across wet planks overhead, to ropes creaking against wooden masts, to the endless groaning rhythm of the hull pushing through black water. There was always movement, even in sleep, even in silence. The ship rolled gently beneath every breath, reminding its exhausted crew that there would be no true rest here. Most medieval pirates remained at sea for months not because they wanted adventure, but because returning to land too often was dangerous, expensive, and sometimes impossible. Ports were uncertain places. Some cities welcomed pirate crews when money flowed freely through taverns and markets. Others hunted them immediately. Local rulers often changed loyalties without warning. A harbor considered safe one season could become deadly the next after political alliances shifted or royal ships arrived unexpectedly. And so many pirate captains preferred to stay moving, far away from walls, far away from laws, far away from questions. At sea, they could disappear into distance itself. The ocean offered something strange, freedom mixed with permanent discomfort. A pirate might spend 3 straight months without touching solid ground. During that time, the body slowly adapted to constant motion. Legs adjusted to shifting decks. Hands hardened from wet ropes and rough wood. Faces darkened beneath endless wind and salt, but the mind changed too. Some sailors eventually forgot what true silence sounded like. On land, the absence of creaking timber and crashing waves felt unnatural to them. Empty rooms became unsettling. Stillness itself seemed wrong. The ship trained the senses to expect noise at all hours. At night, exhausted crew members often woke suddenly from sleep, certain they had heard danger in the darkness. A loose sail snapping in strong wind. Water striking the hull differently than before. The distant crack of wood somewhere below deck. Every sound mattered out here, because small problems became disasters quickly. A leak ignored during calm weather could sink a ship during a storm. Days later, rotten food could spread sickness through cramped quarters. One damaged mast could leave an entire crew stranded beneath a burning sun with dwindling water supplies. Survival depended on attention, constant attention, and yet, despite the danger, pirates kept living this way because life on land often offered them very little. Many had escaped poverty so severe that ship life, uncomfortable as it was, still felt preferable to starving in crowded medieval towns. A sailor at sea might at least receive a portion of captured goods, a chance at payment, a chance at food tomorrow. Even if tomorrow arrived cold and miserable, as the weeks passed, routines formed naturally aboard the ship. Some men repaired torn sails near the mast beneath grey morning skies. Others cleaned rust from weapons while sitting quietly beside barrels of salted meat. Younger sailors carried buckets of seawater across the deck, scrubbing away grime, bloodstains, and algae before the wood became dangerously slippery. The work never truly ended. Ships demanded constant care simply to remain alive. Below deck, the air grew warmer and heavier with each passing day. Supplies shifted slowly as barrels emptied. Fresh food disappeared first. Fruit softened and rotted quickly in damp conditions. Bread hardened like stone. Rats became bolder during the night, slipping between shadows in search of crumbs. Still, the crew sailed onward, beyond coastlines, beyond familiar maps. Sometimes they followed rumors of merchant vessels carrying silver or spices. Other times they simply searched for islands where fresh water could still be collected safely, but the ocean rarely made anything easy. Days of calm wind could trap ships in complete stillness beneath brutal sunlight. Sails hung useless while drinking water slowly vanished barrel by barrel. Men sat quietly beneath strips of shade, sweating through heavy air while staring hopelessly at unmoving horizons. Then, without warning, storms arrived, violent winds tearing across black water, rain hammering the deck hard enough to bruise skin. Waves rising like moving walls beside the ship. During those nights, no one slept properly. Lanterns swung wildly in darkness while sailors fought ropes with numb fingers and salt-blinded eyes. Some whispered prayers beneath their breath. Others simply worked in silence, too exhausted for fear. And afterward, when dawn finally returned, the ship continued drifting forward once again, because there was nowhere else to go. That was the strange truth of medieval life at sea. The pirates aboard these wooden vessels did not belong entirely to land anymore, but neither did they truly belong to the ocean. They existed somewhere in between, floating endlessly through fog, storms, hunger, and silence. Living month after month inside a world built from timber, wind, and uncertainty. And as the distant shoreline disappeared completely behind them, swallowed slowly by grey morning mist, the crew understood something quietly unsettling. For the next several months, this ship would be the only home they had. After enough days at sea, the pirates slowly stopped looking outward. The horizon no longer felt mysterious. The endless water became ordinary. Instead, their world grew smaller, narrower, darker. It shrank into the space below deck, into the heavy wooden belly of the ship where most life truly happened. From above, a medieval pirate vessel could appear almost graceful. Sails moving gently against pale skies. Sunlight touching the mast. Waves rolling softly beneath the hull, but underneath that upper deck existed another world entirely, a world hidden from sunlight, hidden from fresh air, hidden from comfort, the moment a sailor climbed down the narrow ladder below deck. The atmosphere changed immediately. The air felt warmer, thicker, damp with moisture that never fully disappeared. The smell arrived first: salt, mildew, sweat, wet rope, old food, smoke from lanterns, and the sour scent of standing water trap between warped wooden planks. Nothing smelled clean, nothing felt dry. The ceiling overhead was low enough in some areas that taller sailors needed to bend slightly while moving through the darkness. Thick support beams crossed the interior like the ribs of some enormous wooden creature drifting through the sea. A lantern light barely reached the corners. Most shadows remained untouched. At night, the ship groaned constantly around them. Timber creaked under pressure. Nails strained softly with every shifting wave. Water slapped against the hull only inches away from sleeping men, creating a strange feeling that the sea itself was pressing against the walls. Waiting patiently outside, for many pirates, this cramped darkness became their entire reality for months at a time. Privacy disappeared almost immediately aboard ship. A man slept beside strangers, ate beside them, coughed beside them, listened to them snore, whisper, argue, and groan through restless nights. There were no personal rooms for ordinary crew members. Only small spaces carved between supplies, hanging hammocks, crates, and barrels. Every inch mattered. Ships carried food, rope, tools, weapons, spare sails, and trade goods whenever possible. Human comfort came second, sometimes third, sometimes not at all. The lower deck floor rarely stayed dry for long. During rough weather, seawater leaked slowly through gaps in the planks or spilled through hatches overhead. Shoes became soaked. Blankets absorbed moisture. Clothing clung cold against the skin for days without proper sunlight to dry it. Even resting felt uncomfortable. When storms arrived, conditions below deck became even worse. The ship rolled violently from side to side, throwing loose objects across the floor. Barrels groaned against restraints. Lantern flames swung wildly in darkness, spreading nervous shadows across exhausted faces, and the sound was endless. Wind screaming through cracks in the wood, waves crashing hard against the hull, the deep strained groaning of the ship itself fighting to stay together. Some sailors later admitted that during terrible storms, they could not tell whether the noises around them came from wood, water, or their own fear. Yet below deck was also where strange routines quietly formed. One sailor sharpened knives beneath lantern light every evening before sleep. Another carefully folded the same old blanket each morning despite the dampness. Some men carried small objects from home hidden inside pockets or cloth sacks, a wooden charm, a faded letter, a tiny carved cross, little reminders that another life had once existed somewhere beyond the ocean. In quieter moments, sailors sat together on overturned barrels, speaking softly about distant ports they remembered. Warm beaches, forest roads, markets filled with spices and music. The memories often sounded dreamlike now, almost unreal compared to the darkness surrounding them, because below deck, time moved strangely. Without sunlight, hours blurred together easily. A pirate waking suddenly from sleep might not know whether it was midnight or afternoon. Only the changing watch bells above and the behavior of the crew hinted at passing time, and sleep itself was never fully peaceful. The ship never stopped moving, not once. Even during calm seas, the floor shifted gently beneath the body like slow breathing. Some men adapted after weeks aboard. Others remained seasick for entire voyages, waking dizzy and exhausted night after night. The cramped conditions also created tension that could not easily escape. Small irritations grew larger in darkness, someone taking more food than allowed, someone snoring too loudly, someone refusing work during storms. Arguments began quietly but sometimes ended with knives drawn beneath swinging lanterns. Pirate captains understood this danger well. A crowded ship filled with hungry, exhausted men could become unpredictable very quickly, especially after long weeks without land, and still, despite everything, the lower deck offered one thing sailors feared losing most: shelter. Thin wooden walls separated them from the massive cold ocean outside. Fragile walls, yes, but enough to create the illusion of safety, at least for a while. At night, when the lantern flames burned low and conversation slowly faded into silence, the ship seemed almost alive around them. Timber popping softly. Ropes tightening overhead. Water whispering against the hull in darkness. Some sailors lay awake staring upward at the beams above, listening carefully to every sound, because out there, in the endless black water beyond those wooden walls, danger always existed somewhere unseen: a storm, a hidden reef, another ship drifting silently through fog, or perhaps something worse. And as the exhausted crew settled deeper into the damp, crowded darkness below deck, the lantern light flickering weaker with every passing hour, the reality of living inside this floating wooden prison became impossible to ignore. The ship was carrying them forward across the sea, but it was also slowly closing around them. Sleep aboard a medieval pirate ship was never truly complete. It came in fragments, short drifting moments stolen between work, storms, noise, and discomfort. Even the most exhausted sailors rarely rested deeply for long, because the ship itself refused to stay still. Every hour, every minute, the wooden vessel moved beneath them with slow rolling motions that never fully ended. At first, new sailors found it almost impossible. The floor tilted unexpectedly beneath their bodies. Hammocks swayed side to side in darkness. Sudden waves struck the hull without warning, shaking the entire ship hard enough to wake everyone below deck. Some men spent their first nights gripping ropes or wooden beams simply to avoid falling during sleep. Others became violently seasick whenever they closed their eyes. The human body wanted stillness, but the sea offered none. During calmer nights, the movement felt slow and rhythmic, almost like breathing. Sailors wrapped themselves in rough blankets while listening to the soft creaking of timber overhead. Lanterns swung gently from hooks, casting warm golden arcs across the ceiling beams. Those quieter nights could feel strangely peaceful, at least for a little while, but comfort never lasted long at sea. A sudden change in weather could transform sleep into misery within minutes. Strong winds rattled the ship violently. Rain hammered overhead. Waves slammed against the hull with heavy thuds that echoed through the darkness below deck like distant cannon fire. Men rolled inside their hammocks or collided against nearby sailors while trying to remain asleep through the chaos. Some simply gave up resting altogether during storms. Instead, they sat awake in silence waiting for daylight to return. Pirates learned quickly that sleeping aboard ship required adaptation more than comfort. The crew followed rotating watches both day and night, meaning someone was always awake above deck. Certain sailors worked while others rested. Then the cycle changed again hours later. Time blurred into an endless pattern of interrupted sleep and labor beneath shifting skies. There was no perfect nighttime routine, only exhaustion. Many sailors slept fully dressed because emergencies happened too fast for preparation. If sails tore during a midnight storm or another ship appeared suddenly through fog, everyone might be awakened immediately. A pirate fumbling with boots in darkness could cost valuable seconds, and seconds mattered at sea, especially during dangerous weather. Below deck, Sleeping spaces were arranged wherever room existed. Some men rested in hammocks tied between beams, gently swinging above the floor. Others slept directly on rough wooden planks using folded coats or rope bundles beneath their heads. The lucky ones found corners protected from dripping seawater. The unlucky ones woke cold and soaked before morning. Blankets rarely stayed dry for long aboard medieval ships. Dampness crept into everything eventually: clothes, bedding, wood, even skin. After weeks at sea, many sailors carried the permanent smell of saltwater and mildew no matter how often rain washed over them. The body adjusted slowly, but never completely. At night, the sounds below deck formed their own strange world. Quiet coughing, snoring, murmured dreams, the creak of strained ropes overhead, water brushing endlessly against the hull only inches away, and somewhere beyond all of it, the open ocean waiting in darkness. Some sailors feared sleep itself while far from land, not because of nightmares, but because sleep made them vulnerable. A pirate resting too deeply might fail to hear danger approaching. Fires aboard ships spread quickly. Sudden storms arrived without warning. Enemy vessels sometimes appeared silently during foggy nights when visibility disappeared entirely. Even while asleep, part of the mind remained alert, listening, waiting. The older sailors adapted best. They learned how to brace their bodies naturally against the ship's movement. Some could sleep through thunder, shouting, and crashing waves without waking at all. Years at sea had trained them to rest inside constant noise, but newcomers often struggled badly. One young sailor aboard a merchant raiding vessel reportedly stayed awake nearly 3 nights from fear during his first storm crossing. Every groan of timber convinced him the ship was about to split apart beneath the waves. Eventually exhaustion overcame panic. It always did. That was another strange truth about life at sea. The body surrendered in the end no matter how uncomfortable conditions became. Pirates slept because they had no choice, and yet there were rare moments when the darkness below deck felt almost calm. Late at night, after the winds weakened and conversations faded, only the soft rocking of the ship remained. Lantern light dimmed into faint orange glows. Outside, moonlight stretched silently across black water beyond the hull. In those quiet hours, some sailors experienced a strange feeling difficult to describe. Not happiness, not peace, but something softer, a temporary stillness inside the endless motion, the ocean breathing slowly around them, the ship drifting gently through darkness, the exhaustion finally growing heavier than fear. And one by one, beneath old blankets and swinging hammocks, the pirates slowly disappeared into restless sleep while the medieval ship continued carrying them deeper into the unknown sea beyond morning. Long before comfort became something expected, sailors learned to rest wherever space allowed, and aboard medieval pirate ships, space was always limited. Every corner had a purpose, every beam, rope, and plank belonged to survival first, and human comfort second. By the time pirates had spent several weeks at sea, their bodies began adapting to strange sleeping arrangements that would feel unbearable on land. Hard wooden floors became familiar. Coiled ropes became makeshift pillows. Damp blankets became ordinary companions during cold nights beneath the deck. The ship slowly changed what normal meant. Among the most recognizable sights below deck were the hammocks, simple cloth beds suspended from ropes tied carefully between wooden beams. They swung constantly with the motion of the sea, creaking softly in darkness while exhausted sailors drifted in and out of shallow sleep. To someone unfamiliar with life at sea, a hammock might appear relaxing, but medieval ship hammocks were rarely comfortable. The fabric scratched against the skin. Rope knots pressed painfully beneath shoulders and backs. During rough weather, the swinging became violent enough to throw sleeping sailors onto the floor entirely. More than one pirate woke suddenly tangled in cloth after rolling sideways during storms. Still, hammocks offered one important advantage: they kept the body off the wet floor. That mattered more than comfort, because the wooden planks below deck were often soaked with sea water. Mud, spilled drink, and whatever else drifted across the cramped interior during long voyages. Sleeping directly on the floor meant waking cold, stiff, and damp before sunrise, yet many sailors had no hammock at all. Ships carried more crew than proper sleeping spaces whenever captains wanted larger numbers for raids or defense. In those cases, younger pirates and lower-ranking sailors simply rested wherever empty space could be found. Against barrels, beside crates, curled near support beams, some used bundled rope beneath their heads. Others folded old coats into thin cushions that quickly absorbed moisture from the air. After enough nights, the body stopped complaining quite as loudly, but the discomfort never disappeared completely. The lower deck itself felt alive at night. Ropes hanging overhead swayed gently with the ship's movement. Lantern hooks creaked softly. Loose timbers shifted under pressure from the waves outside. Even in darkness, sailors could sense the entire vessel breathing around them like a giant wooden animal floating across black water. During colder nights, pirates wrapped themselves tightly in wool blankets that smelled permanently of salt and smoke. The fabric itched. Fleas sometimes hid within the folds. But without those blankets, the ocean wind creeping through cracks in the ship could leave men shivering until morning. Warmth became precious at sea, especially after storms. On calmer evenings, some sailors preferred sleeping above deck beneath open skies rather than enduring the heavy air below. They rested beside coiled ropes and folded sails while staring upward at endless stars drifting slowly overhead. Out there, at least, the air moved freely, the smell of mildew faded beneath ocean wind, and for a few quiet hours, the world felt larger than the cramped darkness below deck. But sleeping above deck carried dangers too. Unexpected waves swept across the ship during rough weather. Strong winds turned loose ropes into snapping hazards. And during freezing nights, cold mist settled over resting sailors until blankets became soaked by dawn. No place aboard ship offered true safety or comfort for long. That was simply accepted. The crew adapted in small personal ways instead. One older pirate carefully tied extra rope beneath his hammock each evening to steady its movement during storms. Another slept with one arm looped through nearby rigging so sudden waves would not throw him across the floor. Some men wore small cloth wraps over their eyes to block lantern light during daytime rest, tiny solutions inside an uncomfortable world, and slowly, over months at sea, the body changed alongside the routines. Hands hardened, muscles adjusted to balancing on shifting decks. Sleep itself became lighter, quicker, easier to interrupt. A sailor could wake instantly from deep exhaustion if the ship tilted strangely or footsteps rushed suddenly overhead. The sea trained people to remain alert, even while resting. Yet there were still moments of quiet humanity hidden inside the discomfort. Late at night, beneath dim lantern glow, exhausted sailors sometimes helped cover sleeping crewmates with blankets after temperatures dropped unexpectedly. Others shared dry corners during storms or shifted sleeping positions to make room for injured men, not out of softness, but because survival depended on cooperation. At sea, loneliness existed even while surrounded by people, and perhaps that was why the small acts mattered so much: the passing of a blanket, the silent adjustment of a lantern, the quiet understanding between tired men drifting through darkness together. Outside the hull, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath moonlight. Inside, ropes swayed softly overhead while the ship groaned against distant waves, and one by one, stretched across hammocks, rough planks, and narrow corners of the wooden vessel. The pirate slowly settled into another restless night far from land, a night carried gently forward by the endless movement of the sea. There were some things aboard a medieval ship that sailors eventually stopped noticing: the endless creaking of wood, the rolling movement beneath their feet, the distant sound of waves striking the hull through the night. But the smell never truly disappeared. It followed the crew everywhere, into sleep, into meals, into every quiet moment below deck. After enough weeks at sea, the entire ship carried a thick mixture of scents layered together so deeply that no fresh breeze could fully remove them. Salt water soaked the wood day after day, leaving behind a permanent dampness that mixed with sweat, mildew, spoiled food, wet rope, smoke, old clothing, and the faint sourness of standing water trapped in unseen corners of the vessel. The air below deck felt heavy with it, almost warm, almost alive. At first, new sailors reacted strongly. Some covered their noses while descending below deck. Others lost their appetite entirely during meals. The cramped interior smelled nothing like land. Nothing like homes, taverns, forests, or city streets. It smelled like survival trapped inside wet timber, and slowly, the pirates adapted. Human beings become accustomed to almost anything if surrounded by it long enough. That was one of the quieter truths of medieval life at sea. The lower deck rarely received enough clean air. Small openings along the ship allowed some wind inside during calm weather, but during storms or cold nights, those spaces were often closed to prevent flooding. The result was stale air trapped among too many exhausted bodies. Dozens of men slept, worked, coughed, and sweated inside confined wooden spaces for months at a time. The smell settled into everything. Blankets absorbed it, hair absorbed it, even drinking cups and clothing carried traces of salt and smoke no matter how often they were rinsed with seawater. The pirates themselves became part of the ship's scent. Bathing properly at sea was nearly impossible. Fresh water could not be wasted on washing when every barrel mattered for drinking. Sailors occasionally cleaned themselves with seawater, but salt left the skin rough and irritated after repeated use. Beards grew uneven and tangled, hands cracked from constant moisture, clothes stiffened with layers of dried salt. Some older sailors claimed they could identify ships by smell alone before even boarding them. Merchant vessels carrying spices smelled different from fishing boats or naval ships. Pirate vessels often carried the harsh scent of overcrowding, smoke, damp wood, and unwashed wool, a floating world of exhaustion. Below deck, spoiled food added another layer to the atmosphere. Fruit rotted quickly aboard ship. Meat sometimes turned sour despite heavy salting. Grain sacks attracted insects and rats. Barrels leaked. Mold spread quietly across forgotten corners during long voyages, and once decay appeared aboard a ship, it rarely remained contained. The crew constantly battled it. Men scrubbed the decks with seawater to slow rot from spreading through the wood. Damp blankets were hung above deck whenever sunlight appeared. Barrels were checked repeatedly for spoiled supplies. Still, the ocean always seemed to win eventually. Moisture returned, mildew returned, the smell returned. During hot weather, conditions became even worse. The lower deck trapped heat beneath the wooden ceiling until the air felt almost difficult to breathe. Sweat rolled constantly down tired faces while lantern smoke lingered heavily in cramped spaces. Sailors slept with shirts open despite cold drafts simply because the air below deck became unbearable after sunset. And then there were the bilges, the dark lowest section of the ship where dirty water collected beneath the floorboards, a foul mixture of seawater, spilled drink, mud, waste, and rotting debris slowly gathered there over time. Sailors assigned to clean the bilges often dreaded the task more than storms. The smell rising from below was thick enough to make some men dizzy, yet someone always had to climb down there, because if the bilges overflowed, the ship itself could begin to rot from within. Still, strange moments of calm existed even inside those uncomfortable conditions. Sometimes during early morning, after rainstorms passed, fresh ocean wind drifted briefly through the ship. For a few precious minutes, the heavy air below deck softened. Sailors paused quietly, breathing in cold salt breeze as though remembering another world entirely, a cleaner world, a quieter world. But those moments never lasted long. The ship always returned to itself, returned to damp wood, returned to smoke, returned to the human scent of too many exhausted lives crowded together far from land, and perhaps the strangest part was how normal it eventually became. New sailors arriving aboard often looked horrified during their first nights below deck. Veteran pirates barely noticed anymore. Their senses had adjusted completely to the floating atmosphere surrounding them every hour of every day. The smell had become part of the sea itself, part of survival, part of life. Late at night, while lanterns burned low and the ship drifted slowly beneath dark skies, the pirates lay sleeping among the scents of salt, sweat, mildew, and old timber. Outside, the ocean remained cold and endless. Inside, the wooden ship carried the smell of human endurance drifting quietly through the darkness. One breath at a time. Food aboard a medieval pirate ship was never something enjoyed casually. It was counted, protected, watched carefully, because once the coastline disappeared behind the horizon, every remaining crumb became part of survival. At the beginning of a voyage, the supplies often looked plentiful enough. Barrels lined the lower deck beside sacks of grain, dried peas, onions, smoked fish, salted pork, hard bread, and small wheels of aging cheese wrapped in cloth. For a brief moment, the ship almost felt prepared, but the sea changed food quickly. Moisture crept into everything aboard a medieval vessel, no matter how carefully supplies were packed. Salt air soaked the wood. Rain leaked through planks during storms. Condensation gathered below deck during cold nights. Even tightly sealed barrels eventually absorbed dampness after enough weeks drifting across the ocean, and dampness was the beginning of rot. Fresh food disappeared first, fruit bruised and softened within days. Apples wrinkled. Citrus mold. Vegetables became slimy in the darkness below deck where little air moved freely. Sailors often ate the most fragile foods immediately after leaving port because everyone understood they would not last long. After that, meals became simpler, harder, more repetitive. The most common food aboard many pirate ships was hardtack, a dry biscuit made from flour, water, and almost nothing else. It was baked until nearly all moisture disappeared so it could survive long voyages without spoiling completely. The biscuits became so hard that sailors sometimes soaked them in water, soup, or weak beer before eating. Even then, chewing remained difficult. Some pirates joked that hardtack could break teeth faster than storms, but hunger made almost anything edible eventually. Salted meat lasted longer, though not always pleasantly. Pork and beef were heavily packed in salt to slow decay, then stored inside wooden barrels deep below deck. After weeks at sea, the meat often became painfully tough and overwhelmingly salty. Still, the crew ate it. There were few alternatives, and sometimes even preserved meat spoiled despite precautions. Barrels cracked, salt water leaked inside, warm temperatures accelerated decay. When that happened, sailors faced unpleasant choices. Throwing away ruined food meant reducing already limited supplies. Eating spoiled meat risked sickness spreading through the crew. Captains weighed such decisions carefully, especially during long voyages far from land. Rats created another problem entirely. The creatures thrived aboard ships. They hid between crates and crawled silently along beams overhead during the night. Drawn by grain, crumbs, and stored food, rats multiplied quickly inside cramped wooden vessels. Sailors often woke to scratching sounds in darkness or discovered chewed sacks leaking precious grain across the floor. Some pirates kept cats aboard specifically to control them, but even cats could not fully stop the infestation. the ocean carried rats almost as faithfully as it carried men. Meals themselves were usually quiet affairs. Exhausted sailors gathered wherever space allowed, balancing bowls or wooden plates against the ship's constant movement. During rough weather, eating became even more difficult as waves tilted the floor unpredictably beneath them. Soup spilled easily, bread slid across tables, hot broth splashed onto hands already cracked by salt and cold wind, and yet those meals still mattered deeply, not because the food tasted good, but because eating together reminded the crew they were enduring the same hardship side by side. There was comfort in shared survival. On rare occasions, the pirates improved their meals through fishing. During calm weather, sailors lowered lines over the ship's side hoping to catch something fresh from the endless water surrounding them. Fish offered temporary relief from salted meat and stale biscuits. A fresh meal could lift spirits surprisingly quickly aboard ship. For a little while, conversation returned, laughter returned. The crew remembered what variety tasted like, but luck at sea changed constantly. Some days the ocean provided generously, other days it offered nothing at all. As weeks passed, the food slowly deteriorated alongside morale. Bread attracted insects. Cheese hardened or mold. Watered soup became thinner as supplies dwindled. Sailors grew quieter during meals, studying the remaining barrels with increasing concern. Everyone understood the unspoken fear: if the food ran out completely, the sea would become far more frightening than any storm. Older sailors sometimes told stories during late-night meals beneath dim lantern light. Tales of ships trapped without wind for weeks. Crews surviving on tiny rations. Men growing desperate enough to boil leather straps or chew softened rope fibers simply to quiet hunger pains. Whether every story was true hardly mattered. The fear behind them certainly was, and still the ship sailed onward, the lower deck smelling faintly of salt, smoke, and aging supplies, barrels creaking gently with the motion of the waves, lantern light flickering softly across exhausted faces gathered around another small meal in darkness. Outside, the black ocean stretched endlessly beneath cold stars. Inside, the pirates ate slowly and carefully, aware that every remaining piece of food represented one more day between survival and desperation far from land. More frightening than storms, more dangerous than darkness, was the slow realization that fresh water could disappear. At sea, water surrounded the pirates endlessly in every direction, stretching beyond the horizon beneath gray skies and moonlit nights. Waves crashed against the hull day and night without pause, and yet none of it could safely be drunk. The ocean offered abundance and death at the same time. That contradiction followed sailors constantly during medieval voyages. Before leaving port, crews filled heavy wooden barrels with as much fresh water as the ship could carry. Men rolled them carefully below deck beside food supplies and spare rope, stacking them tightly to prevent movement during storms. At first, the barrels seemed reassuring, solid, reliable enough, but time changed water aboard ship almost as quickly as it changed food. The barrels themselves created part of the problem. Medieval containers were made from wood bound tightly with iron hoops, but they were never perfectly sealed forever. Tiny leaks developed slowly during long voyages. Salt air and shifting temperatures affected the timber. Water absorbed strange tastes from the wood itself. After weeks trapped inside darkness below deck, fresh water gradually became stale, flat, sometimes sour. Sailors drank it anyway, because there was no choice. Captains measured water carefully from the very beginning of a voyage. Every sailor received limited portions each day depending on weather, crew size, and distance from land. During especially long crossings, rations became smaller with frightening speed. A thirsty man could think of little else, especially under the endless heat of open skies. On calm days beneath blazing sunlight, the ship transformed into a floating furnace of wood and salt. Sailors sweated constantly while hauling ropes, climbing rigging, and scrubbing decks. Lips cracked. Throats dried painfully. Even breathing felt exhausting in the heavy heat below deck, and still the water barrels remained guarded carefully. No wasting, no extra cups, no careless spilling. Some sailors secretly dreamed about wells, rivers, and cold rainstorms more than treasure, because thirst changed people slowly. It sharpened tempers, weakened bodies, turned small disagreements into dangerous arguments, but stale water was only one part of the fear. Disease haunted medieval ships constantly. In crowded conditions where dozens of men shared cramped sleeping spaces, sickness spread quickly once it appeared. A single infected wound, spoiled food, or contaminated barrel could affect the entire crew within days, and clean water was deeply connected to survival. Sometimes algae or bacteria formed quietly inside neglected barrels during long voyages. Sailors noticed strange smells or cloudy color too late. By then, men had already been drinking from the supply for days. Fever followed, stomach sickness followed, weakness spread below deck while exhausted sailors tried continuing their work despite shaking hands and burning headaches. There were no true cures at sea, no trained doctors waiting beyond the next room. Only rough experience and desperate hope. Some pirate crews drank weak beer or watered wine instead of plain water whenever possible because alcohol helped preserve liquids slightly longer. The drinks were not strong enough to make sailors constantly drunk, as legends sometimes suggest. Mostly they tasted sour, warm, and safer than spoiled water. Rain became precious during certain voyages. When storms approached, sailors rushed above deck with buckets, cloth sheets, and open containers hoping to collect fresh rainfall before it vanished back into the sea. Cold rainwater running across tired faces sometimes felt like a gift from another world entirely. For a few brief hours, the crew could drink without fear of rationing every swallow. But storms brought their own dangers, and rain never lasted forever. The pirates learned quickly how fragile survival truly was in the middle of the ocean. One cracked barrel. One delayed voyage. One stretch of windless weather trapping the ship too long beneath the sun, and thirst began creeping through the crew like a shadow. Older sailors often recognized the signs immediately. Men speaking less, moving slower, watching the remaining barrels too carefully during meals. At night, some pirates lay awake listening to water shift softly inside wooden containers as the ship rolled through darkness. The sound itself became strangely powerful, a reminder that life still existed below deck, but only temporarily. Disease frightened sailors in quieter ways too. Unlike storms, sickness arrived gradually, a cough here, a fever there, one sailor too weak to climb rigging by morning, then another. The lower deck became tense whenever illness spread. Healthy men avoided sleeping too close to the sick if possible, though space aboard ship made true distance impossible. Lantern light revealed pale faces wrapped in damp blankets while whispers moved nervously through the crew. Would the sickness stop, or would it keep spreading? No one ever knew for certain, and still the ship continued onward across the endless water, barrels creaking gently below deck, rain clouds forming and fading beyond the horizon. Exhausted pirates lifting small cups of stale water beneath dim lantern glow while trying not to think about how easily survival could vanish far from land. Outside, the ocean remained vast and silent beneath darkening skies. Inside, thirst and disease drifted quietly beside the crew. Unseen companions on every voyage across the medieval sea. Out at sea, storms did not arrive like visitors. They arrived like changes in the world itself. One moment, the ocean could be calm enough to reflect the sky like polished glass. The next, the wind would shift direction. And everything would begin to feel different, not immediately violent, but quietly wrong. The first warning was often subtle. A strange heaviness in the air. Clouds gathering far away on the horizon, dark and layered like thick ink spreading slowly across paper. Sailors noticed these changes long before the storm reached them, because life at sea trained them to read the smallest signs, and still, nothing truly prepared them for what followed, when storms finally reached a medieval pirate ship. The entire world seemed to narrow into noise and motion. The sea stopped being a calm surface, it became something alive and rising. Waves no longer moved gently beneath the hull. They climbed instead, growing taller, darker, and heavier until the ocean itself felt like it was trying to lift the ship into the sky and pull it back down again without mercy. Below deck, everything changed instantly. Sleeping sailors woke to sudden impact. Wooden beams groaned loudly overhead. Barrels rolled and collided against support walls. Lanterns swung violently, throwing chaotic light across the cramped interior. There was no time for hesitation, only reaction. Above deck, pirates rushed into cold rain and wind so strong it felt like a physical force pressing against their bodies. Sails had to be secured immediately or risk tearing apart entirely. Ropes became lifelines as men tied themselves to the mast just to avoid being thrown into the sea. The ocean during storms did not feel like water anymore. It felt like pressure, constant, overwhelming pressure from every direction. Some waves rose higher than the ship itself. Dark walls of moving water that passed over the deck in seconds, swallowing lantern light and sound before crashing down again into chaos. And still the ship remained afloat. Somehow, for hours that stretched into days, sleep disappeared completely. There was no rest. No quiet moment. Only shifting rotations of exhausted sailors working through darkness and rain. Hands bled from rope burns, clothing stayed soaked without drying, muscles burned from constant effort against wind and movement. Even breathing felt difficult when wind screamed across the deck so loudly it drowned out human voices entirely. Below deck, conditions were equally harsh in different ways. Water leaked through cracks in the wooden ceiling during the worst storms, dripping onto sleeping sailors who had nowhere else to move. The ship tilted so sharply at times that men had to hold on to beams just to avoid sliding across the floor. Nothing stayed still. Not for even a moment, and yet, despite the chaos, something remarkable happened inside every storm. The crew moved together, without needing long explanations, without needing commands shouted twice. Every sailor understood the same silent truth: the ship survived only if everyone worked as one body. There was no room for individuality during storms, only survival. Some pirates later described storm voyages as if the sea had erased time entirely. Days blended into nights. Hunger faded beneath adrenaline. Fear became background noise after the first hours. What remained was effort, endless effort. Captains often stood near the stern watching carefully, issuing short commands when possible. But even leadership felt limited in the face of nature like this. No human order could calm the wind or stop the waves. Only endurance mattered, and sometimes luck. During the worst storms, visibility disappeared completely. The horizon vanished. The sky and sea merged into one dark shifting mass. Sailors could not tell where the ocean ended and the air began. In those moments, fear became quiet, not because it was gone, but because it was everywhere at once. Inside the storm, even sound changed. The roar of wind, crashing waves, snapping ropes, and groaning wood formed a constant background noise so overwhelming that silence became unimaginable. Some men closed their eyes during brief moments of rest, not to sleep, but simply to escape the sight of endless motion. When storms finally weakened, the change was almost unreal. Wind slowly softened, waves settled into longer, calmer rhythms, rain turned to mist, and exhaustion arrived all at once. as if the body had been waiting for permission to collapse. Sailors often sat down where they stood, unable to move for long minutes after surviving days of chaos. Some simply stared at the sea, breathing heavily, listening to the absence of screaming wind like it was something unfamiliar. The ship would be damaged, always, torn sails, broken ropes, soaked supplies, but still floating, still moving forward. And as quiet returned to the ocean, the pirates understood something they never fully said aloud: the storm was never just an event. It was a reminder that out here, beyond land and law and certainty, survival depended on how long wood, rope, and exhausted men could withstand the endless power of the sea, and for now, they had endured again. There was a fear aboard medieval pirate ships that no sailor ever fully outgrew. It did not come from monsters, or enemy ships, or even storms. It came from the simple, silent idea of falling away from the ship, into the open ocean, into water so vast and dark that it swallowed sound, light, and direction all at once. At sea, the ocean did not feel like a surface, it felt like depth without end. And for sailors working high above the deck, climbing rigging that swayed constantly with the movement of waves, that depth was always beneath them, waiting, always waiting. The masts of medieval ships rose like tall wooden towers, holding sails that stretched wide across the sky. Sailors climbed these structures daily, often during wind, rain, or rough seas, to adjust ropes and secure torn fabric. There were no safety systems as we understand them today, only knots, only balance, only trust in worn rope and tired hands. From high in the rigging, the world changed completely. The deck below looked small and distant. The ocean seemed closer than it should have been, rising and falling with slow, terrifying rhythm. Every movement of the ship felt amplified up there, as if the entire structure might suddenly tilt just a little too far. And then there was the wind that did not simply pass by, but moved through everything. It pulled at clothing, hair, and ropes with invisible force. A single misstep could turn balance into disaster in an instant. Sailors learned to move carefully, deliberately, almost slowly, but accidents still happened, always a loose grip during a storm. A rope snapping under pressure. A sudden shift of the ship's weight beneath their feet. These small moments could decide everything, and once a person fell, there was almost no chance of recovery. The ocean did not return what it took. Even experienced sailors understood this truth in their bones. It was not spoken often, but it was always present. Every climb up the mast carried quiet awareness that a single mistake meant disappearance into something endless. No sound would follow, no rescue would come quickly, only water closing above the body. For many pirates, this fear lived strongest at night. During darkness, when the ship moved through quiet waters and lantern light flickered across wet wooden decks, the imagination became louder than reality. Sailors lying in hammocks sometimes pictured themselves slipping from rigging. Even while safely below deck, the mind recreated the fall in detail, the sudden weightlessness, the cold shock of water, the silence that followed. Even experienced men who had survived years at sea admitted this fear never completely disappeared. It simply became something they learned to carry quietly. Above deck, the edge of the ship itself could feel equally dangerous during rough conditions. Waves sometimes washed across the wooden planks without warning, dragging ropes, tools, and anything loose back toward the sea. Sailors working near the rail often tied themselves down during storms just to avoid being pulled overboard. But even in calmer weather, caution remained. A wet deck could be as dangerous as a storm. At night, when the ship moved steadily beneath star-filled skies, the ocean looked peaceful again. Almost inviting. The surface reflected faint moonlight in long, soft patterns that stretched endlessly in every direction. But sailors knew better than to trust that appearance. Beneath that calm surface was the same depth, the same silence, the same endless drop. Some pirates developed strange habits to cope with this constant awareness. They avoided standing too close to the rail for long periods. Others always kept one hand on a rope or wooden beam when moving across the deck at night. Even simple walking became a subconscious exercise in balance and awareness. New sailors often struggled the most. They hesitated near edges, they stared too long into the water, they imagined movement where there was none. Over time, experience dulled the panic, but never erased it completely. The ocean simply demanded respect in silence. There were also moments when fear transformed into something different, not courage exactly, but acceptance. During long voyages, some sailors reached a strange understanding of their environment. The ocean was dangerous, yes, but it was also constant. It did not change its nature for anyone. Learning to live with that reality became part of life aboard ship. Still, even the most experienced pirate felt a quiet tension when climbing rigging during strong winds or darkness. Every knot checked twice. Every step placed carefully. Every breath measured, because survival often depended on small details no one else would notice, and the ocean always noticed everything. Below deck, while others slept in swinging hammocks or on damp wooden floors, the memory of height and depth lingered in quiet thoughts. The fear of falling was not loud. It did not need to be, it simply remained present, like the ocean itself, constant, patient, unmoving in its vastness. And as the medieval ship continued drifting through endless water beneath fading starlight, every sailor aboard understood the same silent truth: they were always only one mistake away from disappearing into the dark sea below, and yet, they climbed again the next day. Life aboard a medieval pirate ship did not run on written laws. There were no courts at sea, no cities to appeal to, no distant authority waiting to judge behavior fairly. Instead, every ship developed its own rules, quiet, practical, and often unspoken until they were broken, and once broken, the consequences were immediate. At sea, discipline was not about tradition or ceremony, it was about survival. A ship was too small, too isolated, and too dependent on cooperation to allow chaos for long. One reckless act could endanger everyone aboard. So even pirate crews, who were often seen as lawless, created strict internal systems to keep order, but these systems varied from vessel to vessel. Each ship became its own small world of authority. The captain stood at the top, but not always with absolute power. Below him were experienced sailors, quartermasters, and officers who enforced rules during daily life. Decisions were rarely democratic, but they were also not completely one-sided. Reputation mattered. Experience mattered. Strength mattered. Respect had to be earned constantly. Rules aboard ship often focused on practical survival. Stealing food was one of the most serious offenses. In a place where supplies were limited and carefully measured, taking more than your share meant reducing someone else's chance of survival. Punishments for such actions could be severe. Not out of cruelty alone, but necessity, sleep deprivation, reduced rations, or forced labor during dangerous conditions were common consequences. On some ships, harsher punishments existed, depending on the captain and crew culture, but even fear-based discipline had limits, because an unhappy crew was a dangerous crew. One of the most important unwritten rules was simple: during storms or combat, every sailor obeyed immediately without argument. There was no time for debate when sails needed securing or ropes needed cutting. Hesitation could sink the ship or cost lives. At those moments, hierarchy became absolute. Outside of emergencies, however, tension often simmered quietly beneath the surface. Living in close quarters meant everyone knew everyone else's habits. There was no privacy. No separation between personal life and working life. Small frustrations could grow quickly: snoring at night, carelessness with tools, arguments over food portions, or disrespect during shared labor, because there was nowhere to escape to. The ship itself contained all conflict and all resolution. Some captains maintained order through fairness. They shared captured goods in agreed portions to keep morale steady. Others ruled through fear, using punishment as their primary tool of control. Most ships existed somewhere between these extremes, shifting depending on circumstances and crew composition, but regardless of leadership style, one rule remained constant across nearly every vessel: the ocean itself was the final authority. If discipline failed, the sea would punish everyone equally. That understanding shaped behavior more than any captain's voice. Even pirates who disliked each other worked together when necessary because failure at sea did not discriminate. A broken rope, ignored responsibility, or careless mistake could doom the entire ship regardless of personal conflicts. This reality created a strange kind of unity, not kindness, but dependence, below deck. Rules also governed daily living. Sleeping spaces were assigned carefully. Weapons had designated storage areas. Certain supplies were protected and could only be accessed under supervision. Even conversation could be regulated during specific watches to avoid distractions. Silence itself sometimes became a rule, especially at night, not for peace, but to conserve energy and maintain alertness among resting crew members. Punishment was not always physical. On some ships, social exclusion was powerful enough. A sailor who broke trust might find others refusing to share tasks, food, or even conversation. In a world where cooperation was essential, isolation could feel as harsh as any physical consequence, and yet, despite strict discipline, pirate crews were not lifeless machines. They argued, they laughed, they sang quietly during calmer hours when tension loosened. Rules did not remove humanity from the ship, they only contained it. There were also moments when rules blurred entirely. During long voyages, exhaustion sometimes made enforcement inconsistent. A tired crew might overlook minor violations simply to preserve energy. And in those moments, the ship would feel slightly more chaotic, but also more human. Still, when danger returned, order returned with it, instantly, because every sailor understood the cost of disorder in open water. A ship without structure was just wood floating toward disaster. By the end of each day, after labor, conflict, and endless motion across waves, most pirates accepted the rules not out of agreement, but necessity. They were part of the invisible framework holding the ship together, like ropes binding sails, or beams holding decks. Unseen, but essential, and as night fell over the ocean once again, lantern light flickering softly below deck, the crew settled into their assigned spaces knowing that tomorrow would bring the same balance of cooperation and tension, a fragile order, maintained not by law, but by the sea itself watching quietly from every direction. Even the calmest sea could not stop human tension from building aboard a medieval pirate ship. The ocean might have been vast and quiet at times, but the ship was not. Inside its wooden walls, everything was close, too close. People shared air, space, sound, and exhaustion without escape. And over time, that closeness began to press against the mind like the weight of the ocean pressing against the hull. Conflicts did not appear suddenly. They formed slowly, like pressure building in sealed wood, a missing ration here, a careless mistake there, a harsh word spoken during exhaustion. On land, these moments would have faded quickly. But at sea, there was no distance to create relief. No streets to walk away into. No rooms to close behind you. Every disagreement stayed inside the ship, watching, waiting. Most tensions began in small, almost invisible ways. A sailor accused another of taking extra food. Someone was blamed for damaged equipment during a storm. A rope was left unsecured, causing trouble later during rough waters. These small incidents accumulated like water leaking into a hidden corner of the hull, unseen at first, dangerous later, because in such cramped conditions, even minor frustrations echoed longer than they should have. Arguments often started quietly below deck. Low voices in shadowed corners near barrels and hammocks. Lantern light flickering above faces that had not properly rested in days. Words became sharper with fatigue, each sentence carrying more weight than intended, and yet, most sailors tried to avoid open conflict. They understood something important: violence aboard a ship was dangerous in ways land-based fights were not. There was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to recover privately. A fight did not end at impact. It ended only when the environment allowed it. Still, fights did happen, especially during long voyages when exhaustion, hunger, and boredom layered together like thick fog inside the mind. When they broke out, they were usually sudden. A shove. A grabbed collar. A burst of frustration after weeks of silence. Other sailors would quickly intervene, not always out of fairness, but practicality. Injuries aboard ship could weaken the entire crew. Every man mattered, even the difficult ones. Above deck, tension sometimes surfaced in different forms. Arguments over navigation decisions, sail handling, or response to weather conditions could flare briefly before being suppressed again by necessity. The sea did not pause for disagreements. Work continued regardless of emotion, so anger was often delayed, stored, carried silently until it found smaller outlets. Below deck at night, tension often softened into quieter forms. Silence between men who no longer spoke after arguments. Avoidance during meals. Careful movements around shared spaces to prevent further conflict. The air itself felt heavier during those periods, not because of physical change, but emotional density, and yet, strangely, there were also moments when tension transformed into unity, not through friendship, but through shared hardship. During storms, when the ship was shaking violently and survival demanded cooperation without hesitation, all personal conflict temporarily disappeared. The same men who argued hours earlier would now pull ropes together, shoulder to shoulder, focused only on keeping the vessel afloat, because the ocean did not care about personal disputes, only survival. After danger passed, silence would return again, but often with slightly less intensity than before. Exhaustion had a way of softening anger. Not removing it, but dulling its edges. In long voyages, crews developed an unspoken rhythm around conflict. Let tension rise slowly. Avoid unnecessary escalation. Wait for work, fatigue, or shared danger to reset emotional balance. It was not peace, but it was stability. Even captains understood this fragile balance. Too harsh a response to conflict could break morale entirely. Too lenient a response could lead to disorder. Leadership at sea was not about eliminating tension, but managing it carefully so it never reached breaking point. Below deck, personal space was almost non-existent. This lack of separation made reconciliation difficult. A man could not easily avoid someone he disliked. He would sleep near them, eat near them, work beside them again the next day. Time alone was rare, so emotions had no real place to fully disappear. Some sailors coped by withdrawing inward. They spoke less, moved carefully, kept to predictable routines. Others stayed busy with tasks, preferring physical exhaustion over emotional confrontation, and some simply endured everything quietly, knowing that leaving the ship was not an option until land appeared again, weeks or months away. Still, despite all this tension, ships did not constantly fall apart. They held, not because conflict was absent, but because necessity was stronger than anger. Every sailor understood that if the ship failed, there would be no sides left to argue on. Only the sea, endless, indifferent, and waiting. And so, even after arguments faded into silence below deck, the ship continued forward through dark water and shifting wind, carrying men who disagreed, but survived together anyway, because out there, beyond land and certainty, cooperation was not optional. It was the only thing keeping the wooden world afloat. On a medieval pirate ship, sickness did not arrive with warning or ceremony. It simply appeared, quietly at first, then it spread. In the cramped wooden world below deck, illness was never just an individual problem. There was no isolation ward, no clean separation, no way to truly step away from others for long. Every sailor shared the same air, the same water, the same food stores, and the same tightly packed sleeping spaces, so when one man fell sick, the entire ship felt it. A simple cough could become something more serious over time. A fever might begin with tiredness, then grow into weakness that made even standing on a rocking deck difficult. In the early stages, sailors often tried to ignore symptoms, hoping the body would recover on its own. Because stopping was not always possible, the ship did not wait. Work still needed to be done, sails still needed repair, ropes still needed handling, and storms did not care who was ill. Below deck, the first signs of illness were usually subtle changes in behavior. A sailor sleeping longer than usual, a man refusing food he would normally eat without hesitation, someone moving more slowly during morning duties, as if his body weighed more than it should. At first, others might not even notice, but in close quarters, nothing stayed hidden for long. Soon, the sick sailor would be resting in a corner near hammocks or barrels, wrapped in whatever cloth he could find. The lantern light above him flickered gently across pale skin and tired eyes. Sweat gathered even in cold air. Breathing became heavier, uneven, and still the ship moved forward. There were no trained physicians aboard most pirate vessels. Only rough experience passed between sailors over years at sea. Remedies were simple, inconsistent, and often based on tradition more than knowledge. Some believed in herbal mixtures carried from shore, others relied on rest when possible. A few trusted alcohol or strong drink to dull pain and discomfort, but none of it guaranteed recovery. Injury was equally common and often more immediate. A slip during rigging work could result in broken bones. A rope burned during storms could tear skin badly enough to prevent a sailor from working for days. Even simple accidents on a wet deck, falling against barrels or slipping on soaked wood, could leave lasting damage. And every injury carried consequences beyond pain, because an injured sailor could not fully contribute, and on a ship, contribution meant survival. During storms, injuries multiplied. Men were thrown against wooden beams. Ropes snapped under tension and whipped across the deck with violent force. Waves crashed over the ship, knocking sailors off balance and dragging tools across slippery surfaces. In those moments, pain was secondary, survival came first. After storms passed, the injured were gathered and treated as best as possible. Bandages were made from torn cloth. Wounds were washed with seawater despite its sting. Broken limbs were supported with makeshift splints crafted from spare wood. It was not healing in any modern sense, it was containment, keeping the damage from worsening. Below deck, sickness created a different kind of atmosphere than storms or conflict. It was quieter, slower, more persistent. The sound of coughing in darkness, the soft moans of men trying to sleep through fever, the careful movement of others trying not to disturb the sick. Even fear changed shape in those moments. It became uncertain, because unlike storms, illness did not pass quickly. It lingered. It weakened. It spread unpredictably. A crew might survive violent weather in a single night, but disease could last for weeks, slowly reducing strength across the entire ship. Food and water made everything more complicated. When supplies became questionable, weakened bodies struggled even more. Dehydration combined with fever made recovery difficult. Simple wounds could worsen if not cleaned properly, and yet, sailors continued working as long as they could stand, because stopping entirely meant risking everyone. In some cases, captains made difficult decisions when illness became severe. Sailors too weak to function might be given lighter duties or isolated as much as the ship allowed, though true separation was nearly impossible in such tight spaces. There were stories, passed quietly between crews, of voyages where sickness became so widespread that nearly every man aboard was affected in some way. In those accounts, ships drifted more than they sailed, guided only by wind and luck, while exhausted crews recovered slowly in cycles. Whether every story was fully accurate did not matter. The fear was real enough. Below deck at night, illness and injury made sleep fragile. A man lying in his hammock might wake to the sound of coughing nearby or the shifting movement of someone in pain. Lantern light revealed tired faces turned toward wooden beams, waiting for morning without certainty of improvement, and still, dawn eventually arrived, every time, sometimes with recovery, sometimes without change, but always with the same ship continuing forward across endless water. Over time, sailors learned to recognize the difference between minor sickness and something more serious. They learned when rest might help and when only time at sea would decide the outcome. They learned that healing aboard a medieval ship was never guaranteed. It was something closer to endurance, a slow negotiation between body, environment, and fate. And as the ship moved steadily through grey waters under quiet skies, the crew continued their routines around the sick and injured, carrying on because there was no alternative path forward. The ocean did not pause for healing, and neither did survival. There were days at sea when nothing happened at all, no storms, no sightings, no battles, no urgent repairs, just the endless movement of water beneath a ship that drifted slowly through empty space. To someone imagining pirate life from stories and legends, these moments might seem peaceful, almost relaxing, but to the men living aboard the ship, long stretches of nothing were often the hardest part of all, because stillness at sea was never truly still. Even on calm days, the ocean kept moving. The ship rolled gently, slowly, endlessly, like it was breathing in a rhythm that never stopped. Time did not feel sharp or clear in those moments. Hours blurred into each other without landmarks to mark their passing. And without urgency, the mind began to wander. Below deck, sailors filled these long empty days with small, repetitive tasks. Ropes were checked and rechecked. Knots were tightened even when they did not need tightening. Wooden planks were scrubbed again and again simply because there was nothing else to do. Maintenance became a way to give structure to time. Above deck, others worked on sails under quiet skies. Even when nothing was broken, they inspected every seam carefully, looking for weak points that might become dangerous later. The ship had to remain ready at all times, even during calm waters, because the ocean could change without warning. But between these tasks, there were long pauses, and in those pauses, silence grew heavy. Sailors often sat near the rail staring into the distance, watching nothing but the horizon. The same horizon they had been watching for days, weeks, sometimes months. It never came closer. It never revealed anything new, only water and sky, and the faint line between them that always seemed just out of reach. Below deck, some pirates passed time through conversation. Not loud or energetic speech, but slow exchanges about past voyages, distant ports, or memories of land that felt increasingly unreal the longer they stayed at sea. Stories became a kind of entertainment, a way to keep the mind from folding inward, others preferred silence. They sat beside barrels or hammocks simply listening to the sounds of the ship. The creak of wood. The distant splash of water against the hull. The soft movement of ropes above. These sounds became familiar enough to feel almost comforting over time, almost. Some sailors carved small objects from spare wood when there was nothing urgent to do. Simple shapes. Rough figures. Marks of time passing without purpose. Others repaired clothing or mended nets, even when damage was minimal, anything to keep the hands busy, because idle hands made the mind restless, and restlessness aboard a ship had no place to go. Occasionally, fishing lines were cast over the side just to break monotony. Not always for food, but for change. The simple act of waiting for a bite created a small moment of anticipation in an otherwise predictable day. Sometimes fish came, sometimes they did not. Either way, the ocean remained indifferent. During these long quiet periods, sleep patterns also shifted. Without clear day-night separation below deck, sailors sometimes slept in irregular intervals. A man might rest for a few hours, wake, work briefly, then sleep again later without realizing how much time had passed. Time lost structure at sea when nothing demanded attention, and yet, even in boredom, the ship required constant awareness. A sudden change in wind could turn a calm day into preparation for danger. A distant shape on the horizon might require investigation. Even silence itself could be misleading, because the sea rarely stayed predictable for long. Still, there were moments of strange calm beauty during these long stretches. Sunlight reflecting gently across still water. Clouds drifting slowly overhead. The ship moving so smoothly that for brief minutes it almost felt like standing on solid ground again. Those moments were rare and fleeting, but they softened the weight of monotony just enough for sailors to continue. At night, when work finally slowed, the crew gathered in small groups below deck. Some spoke quietly. Some simply rested. Lantern light flickered gently across tired faces, casting long soft shadows against wooden beams. There was no excitement in these hours, only endurance, and yet, even boredom at sea carried its own kind of danger. Too much stillness allowed frustration to grow quietly. Minor disagreements felt larger. Small annoyances became sharper. Without distraction, people began noticing everything more intensely, so captains often encouraged routine even during calm periods. Predictable schedules helped prevent tension from building. Even simple tasks, cleaning, checking supplies, practicing rigging work, gave structure to otherwise empty days, because structure kept the ship stable. Not just physically, but emotionally, and so the pirates continued through long stretches of nothingness, moving between small tasks, quiet conversations, and moments of watching endless horizons that never changed, until eventually, something always did, a shift in wind, a distant shape, a warning that the calm would not last forever, and so even boredom became part of survival, a pause between dangers. A quiet space where the ocean allowed its crew to breathe, before reminding them once again that nothing at sea ever truly stayed the same. In the modern world, we imagine navigation as something precise, screens, coordinates, digital maps glowing in the dark, but aboard a medieval pirate ship, direction was something far more uncertain, something read from the world itself, not from instruments, but from observation, from memory, and from experience that could take years to build. There were no satellites watching the ocean, no accurate forecasts guiding the way ahead. Only the sky above and the water below, both constantly changing in ways that demanded attention. Navigation began with the stars. At night, when clouds allowed it, sailors studied the sky carefully. Certain constellations moved slowly across darkness in predictable patterns. Experienced sailors memorized these movements and used them as guides for direction, even when land was far beyond sight. But the stars were not always visible. Storms often erased them completely. Clouds covered the sky like thick blankets of shadow, leaving the ship without its most reliable reference point. In those moments, navigation became more uncertain, relying on instinct and fragmented knowledge. During daytime, the sun became another guide. Its position in the sky helped estimate direction and time. But even this method required experience and careful judgment, especially when weather distorted visibility or haze softened the horizon. Some sailors relied on wind patterns. Others studied wave direction, noticing how currents shifted across different regions of the sea. Over time, they learned to recognize subtle changes that indicated proximity to coastlines or hidden hazards beneath the water. But none of these methods were exact. They were interpretations, guesses shaped by experience. Mistakes could lead ships far off course for days or even weeks without anyone realizing it immediately. The ocean often looked the same in every direction, making errors difficult to detect until supplies began running low or land failed to appear when expected. Below deck, maps existed, but they were often incomplete, worn, and sometimes inaccurate. These charts were drawn from previous voyages, rumors, or rough estimations passed between sailors over time. Coastlines might be slightly incorrect. Distances could be misleading. Entire islands might be missing or misplaced, yet these maps were still precious. They were one of the few tools connecting pirates to direction in an otherwise boundless world. Captains guarded them carefully, not because they were perfect, but because they were all that existed. During voyages, navigation decisions were often made at the stern of the ship, where the view of sea and sky was widest. The captain or navigator would stand quietly for long periods, observing light, wind, and motion before choosing a course. Sometimes the decision came quickly, other times, it required hours of waiting for clearer signs, because choosing wrongly could lead the ship into dangerous waters, unknown reefs, or empty ocean stretches where supplies would slowly run out. Sailors rarely questioned these decisions openly. Not because they trusted blindly, but because they understood the limitations of everyone aboard. No one possessed perfect knowledge. Every direction carried uncertainty. Even experienced navigators made mistakes, and those mistakes were remembered for a long time. Below deck, crew members often discussed navigation quietly during long evenings. Some shared stories of voyages that ended in unexpected places. Others recalled moments when land appeared suddenly after days of uncertainty, as if the ocean had finally decided to reveal its edge. These stories carried both hope and unease, because they reminded everyone how thin the line was between direction and disorientation. Weather played a constant role in navigation as well. Strong winds could push ships off course without immediate detection. Calm winds could trap them in place for days, making progress impossible. Fog could erase visibility entirely, leaving sailors to rely only on sound and instinct. In such conditions, the ship felt truly isolated, disconnected from everything, even from certainty itself. Still, sailors adapted. They learned to trust patterns rather than precision. To accept that movement across the sea was never perfectly controlled. Progress was measured not in straight lines, but in shifting corrections over time, a slow negotiation with nature. Some navigators developed personal systems. Counting wave intervals. Watching seabird behavior. Observing floating debris or changes in water color. Each detail added another layer of understanding, though never complete certainty. The ocean demanded patience more than accuracy, and patience was something sailors learned in abundance. At night, when the ship drifted under starless skies or through thick fog, uncertainty felt heavier. The absence of landmarks made direction feel almost imaginary. Only the sound of water against would confirm that movement still continued. In those moments, the crew relied entirely on trust. Trust in the navigator, trust in the ship, trust in survival continuing despite uncertainty, and somehow, most of the time, it worked. The ship reached coastlines, found ports, returned to familiar waters eventually, not because the sea was predictable, but because experience slowly shaped enough understanding to guide them through its unpredictability, and so, across endless water with no fixed road ahead, medieval pirates traveled. Forward using only the sky, the wind, and memory as their map, a fragile system, imperfect, but enough to keep them moving through the unknown. There was a moment at sea when everything changed. It did not arrive with storms, or battles, or visible disaster. It arrived quietly. Through empty barrels, at first, the crew might not notice anything unusual. Meals would simply feel slightly smaller. Rations would be a little tighter than before. The captain would speak less about food stores and more about careful use and discipline. But slowly, the truth became impossible to ignore. The ship was running low, not on courage, not on will, but on food, and at sea, that was the beginning of something far more serious than discomfort. Below deck, sailors began checking supply barrels more often than usual. The sound of lids opening and closing became frequent. Hands lingered a little longer on nearly empty sacks of grain. Men who once ate quickly now slowed their pace, as if trying to make each bite last longer inside their mouths. Hardtack, once already difficult to chew, now became something carefully rationed. Pieces were broken into smaller portions, sometimes shared between two men instead of one. Salted meat, if still available, was cut thin enough to stretch across multiple meals, and still it was not enough. When supplies ran dangerously low, the entire atmosphere of the ship changed. Silence became heavier. Even simple conversations felt reduced, as if speaking too much might somehow consume energy that could not be replaced. The ocean, unchanged and endless, surrounded them without offering help. Fish were not always available. Weather might be too rough for fishing lines. Calm waters might stretch on for days without anything near the surface. The sea gave no guarantees, and hunger made that fact sharper. As days passed, the crew's focus slowly shifted. Tasks that once felt routine became more exhausting. Climbing rigging, hauling ropes, and maintaining sails demanded more effort from bodies already weakened by reduced meals. Strength faded quietly, not suddenly, but steadily. Below deck, the smell of food storage areas changed too. Empty barrels no longer carried the scent of preserved meat or grain, but a hollow wooden dryness. Even the absence of food had its own atmosphere, an emptiness that seemed to echo through the ship's interior. Some sailors tried to distract themselves by sleeping more. Others kept busy with maintenance work simply to avoid thinking about hunger. But hunger was not something that stayed away for long. It followed every movement, every pause, every quiet moment between tasks. At night, it became more noticeable. Lying in hammocks or on wooden floors, sailors often felt their stomachs tighten in the silence. Sleep came slower. Dreams, when they arrived, often involved food, fresh bread, warm meals, distant memories of land they had not seen in months. The mind became preoccupied in ways that were difficult to control. Captains faced difficult decisions during these periods. Rationing had to be strict, but not so strict that the crew lost all strength to work. It was a constant balance between preserving supplies and preserving the people who used them. There were no perfect answers. Only compromise. Sometimes, ships altered course in search of ports or trading opportunities sooner than planned. But reaching land was never guaranteed, and changing direction carried its own risks. Longer voyages, uncertain waters, and potential danger along unfamiliar routes. so crews often had to endure, day after day, meal after meal, stretching what little remained across uncertain time. In the worst cases, stories passed quietly between sailors spoke of voyages where hunger became so severe that even the smallest scraps were treated as valuable. Nothing was wasted. Crumbs were collected carefully. Broth was stretched thinner. Anything edible, no matter how minor, gained importance, but even in hardship, discipline held the ship together. Barely, arguments could become sharper when hunger increased. Tempers shortened. Small frustrations felt larger. But most sailors understood that fighting over food would only make survival harder for everyone, so restraint became necessary, not because tension disappeared, but because survival required it. Occasionally, the ocean offered relief. A successful fishing catch could temporarily restore morale. Even a small amount of fresh food felt significant after days of scarcity. Conversations returned briefly. Energy lifted slightly. The ship felt less heavy for a short time, but the relief never lasted long. Hunger always returned, because the sea was vast and its generosity unpredictable. As supplies continued to shrink, the crew became more aware of every remaining barrel, every remaining portion. The presence of food was no longer taken for granted, it became something measured constantly in the mind, even when not being eaten, and through it all, the ship kept moving, not quickly, not comfortably, but forward. Carrying exhausted sailors across an endless ocean where survival depended not only on skill or strength, but on how long a dwindling supply of food could stretch before land appeared again on the horizon. There was a point in long voyages when the ocean stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like enclosure. At first, the sea is wide and open, almost freeing in its endlessness. The horizon stretches in every direction, promising movement and possibility. But after weeks, or months, that same horizon becomes something else entirely, a boundary that never breaks, a circle that never opens. For medieval pirates living aboard ships for long stretches, isolation was not a moment. It was a condition. A slow, continuous experience that shaped thoughts in ways they did not always notice at first. There were no distant towns appearing on the edge of sight. No changing landscapes. No new faces beyond the crew already aboard. Every day brought the same wooden walls, the same rope lines, the same familiar voices repeating in the same confined space. Even the ocean, for all its motion, began to feel repetitive. Waves rose and fell, light shifted, wind changed direction, but the feeling of being surrounded by water without escape remained constant. Below deck, this isolation often became psychological rather than physical. Sailors spent long hours in dim lantern light, hearing only the creaking of wood and the soft rhythm of water against the hull. In such an environment, the mind began to turn inward more often than usual. Memories of land became sharper. Not just large memories like cities or ports, but small ones, the feeling of dry ground underfoot, the sound of crowded streets, the smell of earth after rain. Even conversations from long ago surfaced unexpectedly during quiet moments. These memories felt distant, almost unreal, as if belonging to another version of life. Time at sea distorted perception. Without external change, days became harder to distinguish. One morning blurred into the next. Sleep cycles shifted without clear structure. Some sailors felt as if they were no longer moving forward in time, but simply existing within it. Stagnation became a quiet burden. Even though the ship was always moving, social dynamics aboard the ship added another layer to isolation. The same faces, the same voices, the same habits repeated endlessly. At first, familiarity brought comfort. But over time, it could also create emotional fatigue. There was no escape from people you disagreed with, no distance to reset tension, only repetition. Some sailors coped by withdrawing inward. They spoke less, observing more. Others filled silence with constant tasks, preferring physical exhaustion over mental stillness. A few maintained routines as tightly as possible, using structure to anchor themselves against the drifting feeling of time, and yet, even those strategies had limits, because the sea did not change its nature for anyone's comfort. At night, isolation often felt strongest. The ship would move through dark waters under fading starlight or heavy cloud cover, and the absence of land made the world feel reduced to motion and sound alone. Lantern light below deck created small pockets of warmth, but outside those circles, darkness felt vast and unbroken. Some sailors experienced a strange sensation during these periods, as if the ship was the only inhabited place in an otherwise empty world. The ocean did not feel like a route anymore. It felt like separation from everything else that existed. Occasionally, distant sightings would break the monotony. A passing ship on the horizon. A flock of seabirds. Floating debris that hinted at unseen land far away. These brief moments reminded the crew that the world beyond the sea still existed. But they were rare, and often fleeting. As isolation deepened, imagination sometimes filled the gaps left by silence. Sailors would think more intensely about what might be happening elsewhere, what life looked like beyond the horizon, whether people on land were living normal days without awareness of those drifting at sea. These thoughts were not always comforting. Sometimes they created a quiet sense of detachment, as if the ship itself belonged to a different version of reality. Still, routine prevented complete psychological drift. Daily tasks, repairing sails, maintaining ropes, checking supplies, provided enough structure to keep minds anchored to physical reality. The ship demanded attention, and that demand kept sailors present even when thoughts wandered. Isolation never fully broke them, but it shaped them, slowly, quietly. Over time, the crew developed an understanding that the sea was not just a place of travel or danger. It was a place that removed everything familiar until only the present remained, no past within reach, no future visible, only the current moment of wood, wind, water, and endurance. And in that stripped-down existence, each sailor learned how much of human life depends on constant change, and how unsettling it becomes when change disappears for too long. After long stretches at sea, land did not feel like a destination, it felt like a memory made real again. But for medieval pirates, reaching shore was never guaranteed. It depended on wind, supplies, navigation, and sometimes luck more than planning. So when a coastline finally appeared on the horizon, it was not greeted with celebration at first. It was observed quietly, carefully, as if it might disappear if looked at too eagerly. Only when the ship drew closer, when the shape of land became undeniable, did something shift in the crew. The tension that had built up over weeks or months at sea loosened slightly, like rope finally given a small amount of slack. Approaching shore was not simple. The ship slowed, sails were adjusted, navigation became more precise as shallow waters, hidden rocks, and shifting tides demanded careful attention. Even after surviving storms and hunger, the final approach to land carried its own kind of risk, because many ships were lost not in open ocean, but near coastlines. When the anchor finally dropped, the sound felt heavier than usual. A deep metallic pull through water and wood that signaled something rare, stillness that was not temporary movement. For many sailors, this was the first time their feet would touch stable ground in months, and that moment felt strange. At first, standing on land did not feel natural. The body still remembered the constant motion of the sea. Some sailors swayed slightly even on solid ground, as if expecting the earth to shift beneath them. Balance had to be relearned. The shore itself was often simple, rocky edges, small beaches, or wooden docks attached to quiet ports. But to the crew, it felt overwhelming in its stillness. No rolling waves underfoot. No creaking wood. No constant wind pressing against sails, just silence in a different form. Shore leave was never entirely carefree. It depended on permission, timing, and the condition of the ship. Some sailors were sent into nearby settlements to trade, gather supplies, or repair equipment. Others remained behind to guard the vessel, but those who were allowed ashore experienced a brief shift in life's rhythm. Walking on land changed everything. Steps felt slower but more stable. The horizon no longer moved with them. Sounds were different too, less wooden creaking, more distant human life, animal sounds, and the natural stillness of grounded environments. Even air felt different, less salt-heavy, less enclosed. In small coastal towns, pirates often moved quietly through narrow streets, exchanging goods or searching for what they needed most, fresh supplies, repair materials, or simply restocking what the sea had taken away. Food tasted different on land. Even simple meals felt richer after months of repetition at sea. Fresh bread, clean water, fruits, and cooked meals reminded sailors of what had slowly faded into memory during long voyages. But shore leave was always limited. Time moved quickly on land, because ships could not remain docked forever. Weather changed. Opportunities shifted. Other crews moved through ports. And the sea always called them back eventually. Still, those short pauses mattered deeply, not just physically, but mentally. Sailors would sit near docks or on wooden crates, sometimes in silence, simply watching stable movement around them. People walking without swaying. Animals moving across solid ground. Structures that did not shift with waves. It felt almost unreal after so long at sea. Some sailors used shore leave to sleep properly for the first time in weeks. On land, sleep was different, less interrupted by motion, less shaped by the rocking of the ship. Even dreams felt steadier. Others spent their time speaking with locals, hearing news from distant places. These conversations reminded them that the world beyond the ocean continued moving without them. Life had not stopped, it had simply continued elsewhere. But even in moments of relief, there was always awareness of return. Ships could not remain in port indefinitely. Supplies would be loaded, repairs completed, plans adjusted, and eventually, the crew would gather again aboard the vessel. The ocean would wait. As it always did, leaving shore was often quieter than arriving. There was no dramatic farewell. Just gradual boarding, final checks, and the slow preparation of sails as the ship prepared to move back into open water. Some sailors looked back at land for a long time during departure, not because they were leaving something behind permanently, but because they were unsure when they would see it again. Once the ship drifted away from shore, the land slowly shrank into the horizon until it became just another distant shape blending into sky and sea. And then it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The familiar motion of the ocean returned. The creaking wood, the shifting deck, the endless water in every direction. But something subtle remained, a memory of stillness, a reminder that solid ground existed somewhere beyond the horizon, and that someday, perhaps, they would feel it again beneath their feet. For most sailors aboard medieval pirate ships, the idea of home slowly changed over time. At first, it was a place they would return to soon, a town, a family, a familiar shore waiting beyond the horizon. But as months at sea stretched into years of repeated voyages, that certainty began to fade. Distance was no longer just physical. It became emotional. Memory itself started to feel less reliable, as if the world they once belonged to was drifting further away with every passing tide. the ocean did not take people all at once. It took them slowly, through time, through change, through the simple fact that life kept moving even when they were gone. Many pirates never returned home because they simply never stopped sailing. Ships did not always have a fixed route back. Voyages were shaped by opportunity, new targets, trade routes, changing winds, shifting alliances, and survival needs. One journey often flowed directly into the next without a clear ending point. There was no final return built into the life, only continuation, and for some, that became permanent. Below deck, sailors often spoke about home during quiet hours, but these conversations changed over time. Early in a voyage, memories were sharp and detailed. Faces were clear. Streets were vivid. Names were spoken often, but after enough time at sea, those memories softened, not because they disappeared, but because distance made them harder to hold with certainty. A sailor might remember the feeling of a place more than its details. The warmth of a room. The sound of a voice. The shape of a coastline at sunset. But precise images began to blur, replaced by general impressions. Meanwhile, the ship became more familiar than land ever was. The rhythm of ropes, the sound of wood creaking, the constant motion beneath their feet, this became normal life, and what is normal often becomes what feels like home. Another reason many never returned was simply survival itself. The sea was unpredictable. Storms, disease, hunger, injury, and navigation errors all reduced the chances of a long life at sea. Some ships were lost entirely, disappearing into storms or unknown waters without record or return. Others changed direction permanently, never reaching ports that would connect them back to where they started, and even when survival was possible, returning required opportunity, safe passage, shared profit, or a captain's decision. Not every crew disbanded in a way that allowed individuals to simply walk away and go back to their original lives. Some sailors were bound by circumstance, others by necessity. Over time, identity itself began to shift. A man who had once belonged to a town or village became defined more by the ship he sailed on than the place he left behind. Crew loyalty, shared experience, and survival replaced older connections. Home became less about geography and more about belonging. Still, moments of longing never fully disappeared. On calm nights at sea, when the sky was clear and the water gentle, some sailors would stare into the distance and imagine what remained unchanged on land. They would picture streets they had not walked in years, rooms they had not seen since youth, but imagination could only go so far, because the longer they stayed away, the more uncertain those images became. Even if they returned, they often found that home had changed without them. People aged. Buildings shifted. Life moved forward. What once felt familiar might no longer match memory exactly, and that realization was sometimes more difficult than the voyage itself. So many sailors made an unspoken choice without ever clearly stating it. They continued forward, not because they had forgotten home, but because returning no longer felt simple, or certain, or sometimes even possible in the way they once imagined. Instead, the sea became their constant, their routine, their world. And the ship became the only place that remained unchanged long enough to depend on. In that quiet way, without dramatic endings or final goodbyes, many pirates slowly drifted into lives where the ocean was no longer something they traveled across, but something they lived within, and home became a place that existed more in memory than in direction. In the end, there was no single moment when life at sea stopped feeling like a journey. For many medieval pirates, it simply became something that continued until it no longer could. The ocean did not announce endings. It did not mark time the way land did. There were no clear borders between one stage of life and the next. Only shifting winds, changing skies, and the slow passage of days that blended into each other like water into water. Some ships disappeared quietly over the years, not in great dramatic battles, not always in storms, but in long, unrecorded fading, crews growing smaller, supplies thinning, voyages stretching further than intended until there was no clear distinction between sailing and surviving. On other ships, the end came differently. A final storm that the vessel could not endure. A navigation error that led too far from familiar waters. Or simply the natural breaking point of wood, rope, and human endurance worn down by time. But even then, the sea remained unchanged. It did not remember who had sailed upon it. Below deck, in the final quiet moments of long voyages, everything felt slower. Movements became minimal. Conversations rare. The sound of creaking wood became more noticeable than human speech. Lantern light flickered softly across worn beams and tired faces that had seen too many endless horizons. Sailors who had once been full of energy now moved with calm acceptance. Not fear. Not excitement. Just the quiet understanding that life at sea was no longer something separate from existence. It had become existence itself. There was no grand farewell, only continuation until stopping. Some pirates spent their final days repairing what could no longer truly be restored. Ropes were still tied. Sails were still checked. Habits remained even when purpose had faded, as if routine itself held everything together until the very last moment. Others simply sat quietly on deck, watching the ocean they had known for so long. The same water. The same horizon. The same endless movement that had once carried them through youth, hunger, storms, and silence. Now it simply carried them toward an ending that felt less like arrival and more like disappearance. And yet, the sea was not cruel, it was indifferent. It had always been the same vast presence from the beginning. What changed was only the people moving across it. When the final moments came, whether in calm water or beneath heavy skies, there was no audience. No announcement. Only the ship, the wind, and the endless ocean continuing as it always had, and afterward. Silence in the way only the sea can hold it. No stories recorded in detail, no certainty about where every vessel went, only fragments passed between ports and memories that softened over time. What remained was not always fact, but feeling, the feeling of wood beneath feet that never stopped moving, the feeling of wind against sails that carried people far beyond where they began, the feeling of lives shaped entirely by something larger than themselves. And perhaps that was the closest thing to an ending the ocean ever offered, because out there, on the edge of everything known, life did not conclude neatly. It drifted, slowly, quietly, into the same vastness it had come from. And long after the last voices faded from a ship, the sea continued its rhythm without pause, as if nothing had ever changed at all.